Hello everybody, thank you for joining this webinar. It's a joint offering this month from ClearBox Consulting and Valo in Finland. I'm Sam Marshall, Director of ClearBox, and at ClearBox we're UK based and we specialise in strategy and governance and adoption for intranets and digital workplaces. So we don't sell any tools, but we do help on the management and business side of intranets. With me today is Juha. Juha, do you want to say hello?
Yeah, hi everybody, and thanks for having me here in the webinar with you. A great honor to be here with ClearBox Consulting, great professionals. Yeah, my name is Juha Koivula. I'm a product manager from the Valo team. So Valo, what it is, it's Europe's best intranet product, awarded now by the European SharePoint community, now twice in a row. And yeah, before or beside Valo, I've also worked as an intranet or SharePoint consultant for more than 10 years. Mostly with customers in Europe, but also a couple of years in Latin America. Oh, and what comes to the topic of this webinar, multilingual, I have to say I'm a bit of a language machine myself. I speak 4 languages fluently, and I understand a couple of more. But obviously I'm no match to these machine translation services such as Microsoft Translator, which speaks 60 languages. So that will be the main focus of this webinar, right?
You put me to shame, Juha. I speak English and English with a northern accent when I'm at home. It's like as far as it goes. It wouldn't be a webinar without a poll. So let's start with a poll. If you can open that one up, Wedge. Our question for you this time is, think about what happens within your organization. How many working languages are used? So by working languages, it might be a language where it's normal to write an email or see a news story written in that language. So we've got a choice of 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5 or more. So just while you're settling in and getting your cup of tea, let's have a look at what a bunch of polyglots we have on the webinar today. Give you a moment or two more to make your choices. Counting on fingers, no doubt, as well. Wedge, how are we doing for responses? Shall we give people a few seconds more?
Yes, I think they're just rounding out now. You can see that 2 and 5 languages are very popular. Can you see that, Sam?
No, I can't, but I'll take your word for it.
Okay, well, let me close the poll and tell you that 39% of respondents are dealing with 2 languages, 12% dealing with 3, 5% dealing with 4, and 30% are dealing with 5 or more languages.
Wow, so that's interesting. And what I'm guessing then is that the ones dealing with 2 are those in bilingual countries where often there's a legal requirement, and those dealing with 5+ are the proper multinationals where they've got sales or even major operations happening around the world. And there's the poll results. Okay, so what we're going to cover today. Let's talk first of all about what multilingual means and ways in which you might manage content. So I'll be taking you through some different characterizations of the options. And Juha and I are going to discuss about managing the process and some of the workflow and indeed the politics that come around language. And then I'll hand over to Juha for the second half of this presentation, where he's going to show us how to make it work in SharePoint and do a live demo as well. There'll be time for Q&A at the end, but as we go through, if you've got any questions that you want to put into the chat panel within the GoToWebinar interface, and please do so, and we'll feed those in if appropriate as we go through. So when we're saying multilingual, it can actually mean multiple things. So at a kind of base level, why it matters is that in some countries like Canada, Belgium, and Wales, in the UK, it can be a legal requirement that you do things in multiple languages within work, and that includes, of course, the intranet. But also what I've seen, and probably what's driving those 5+ poll responses, is much more of a shift for companies to try and work on a global basis. Maybe 10, 15 years ago, they would set up different company operations within each individual country, and they would operate with a great deal of autonomy. Now it's easier to communicate and collaborate together. They're starting to form teams where that isn't the case. The teams are global or span a whole region. And if you're in like Europe, Middle East, and Africa, then that can easily be 20 languages plus just within that zone. And what we need to remind ourselves is that we can't communicate with people unless you can understand what we're saying. And there are degrees of linguistic ability. So some people might be comfortable reading a simple document, but not so comfortable dealing with a conversation. And if we don't get this right, if we don't acknowledge that comprehension barrier, then the them and us kind of mindset that you often see between head office and regional operations can be 10 times as bad, because not only is there a cultural distance, but there's also a linguistic distance. When we get it right, the great thing about intranets is that it can be a fantastic way to reach across all of this global organization and give people global news at the same time for everyone, give access to the same services and access to common ways of working. So when we say multilingual, there's a different range of ways of tackling this. It could be simply that when you go into your web browser, you can change settings, or if you're in something like SharePoint, you can change settings so the menu options go into your default language and script. Or it could mean that on your intranet, you've got some sites that are in local language and some that are in the company-wide language. It could even mean that on a page you see several languages, or that there's a little flag button where you can toggle the page between different translations. And I guess at the most extreme end, it could even be that all your documentation, you can search in one language and find results written in many languages. So we'll be talking about the implications of these different takes on what multilingual means during this presentation. If you boil it down, though, I see basically 3 different possible approaches. You've got multiple sites, you've got content variants, and you've got mix and match. Let me take you through each one of those in turn. At its most basic level then, imagine we've got 3 employees in the UK, France, and Italy, all dressed according to their national stereotypes in this little icon that we got. So often when intranets start to grow into in a multinational business, each of these individuals would have their own site. The UK person would only go to a UK one, the French person would go to a French one, and so on. And then you get a reorganization, and someone at the top says, but this is ridiculous. We're not collaborating. We're all working in silos. Let's create some kind of global intranet on top, and probably we'll do that just in the local global language, which tends to be English as the kind of lingua franca. Always amuses me that the term for international language is lingua franca in English as well. And then you try and drag people into it. So what you're doing, in fact, is creating separate sites, each just in one language. And if you want to share anything between these sites, such as the Italian business copying something in the French business, probably they just do a copy of the text, they translate it offline, and then they upload something which is then a separate Italian translation. So why would you do this? Primarily because it's cheap and it's simple. And it happens without any kind of grand plan behind it. But what you get is something that has a strong local feel to it. And that can be good if the way in which the organization works is quite local as well. On the downside, getting people to go away from their local site and go and see that global one can be quite a struggle. You get this bit of a battle about what the start page should be, and people trying to change browser settings to force someone to a local page that they don't really like. And if something does get translated between, say, the French and the Italian site, and then the source copy changes later on, then there's no way of keeping track to make sure the Italian copy is also up to date. So a much more sophisticated and scalable way to handle this is to actually do the content variations model. So in this, our 3 employees in London, France, and in the UK, France, and Italy all go to a single homepage, but it uses the browser preferences or the profile settings to serve up that content in whatever language suits them. And then when they go to subsections like strategy or products, they would also see that content rendered in the language of their preference. It doesn't mean that everything on the internet gets translated into every language. For example, for the Italian HR pages, it may be that it only really applies within Italy, so there's no point in having it in French, but you might do it in English if you're a British company or an American company, so that expats can understand it too. So what we're doing here is using a smarter content management system that's delivering up content to match the user's preferred language. And also probably behind the scenes having workflow to manage the version control, and we'll come on to that shortly. What's good about this is that it gives a true mix between a global and local experience. There isn't that tension between seeing things on a local site versus a global site. And if it's done well, it keeps all the content in sync. The downside is that it's big and complex to set up. There is an implementation cost in getting a smart CMS that can manage all this. And it commits you to an overhead of translating most things most of the time, which can work out expensive if you're supporting 5+ global languages. The other thing to watch out, which is sometimes overlooked, is that you need really quite simple page layouts to handle this. Because if you don't, your designs can start to look very messy, and we'll show you some examples of that later. The third option is something of a middle ground. And this is what I often see in practice, which is the intranet serves up the local language if it has it, but if it doesn't have it, then it serves up the default language. So in this example on the left, you'll see our UK person sees everything in English, so that's fine for them. Our French person sees all the global content translated into French and some local French content in preferred language. But the engineers, they don't get it all translated. They have to speak English so they can collaborate with everyone else in their function. And the Italians have it worst of all. So let's say that the company policy is not to translate global corporate news into Italian. So they have to deal with English for that and engineering. And all they get is local news written in Italian. So the risk with this is that it starts to feel like if you're an Italian, you are a sideline in this global business. Why people do it largely is because that commitment in Model 2 of translating everything just gets too expensive. By saying, look, we'll have some local content where we don't translate it, we just leave it in Italian or French, that's fine. And we'll limit what we translate to the truly global things, the policies, the strategy, the really corporately important stuff. That much we'll fund. It allows you to make progress without leaving big white gaps on the page. And it also allows you to pragmatically publish quite quickly. So there's three different options for you. How do you manage that process behind the scenes? Well, to get it right, it does take good planning. If we think, for example, about publishing a breaking news story, say your company's quarterly results are available, what it's going to take is that someone actually drafts that news article, maybe a couple of days in advance, and lets all the communication teams and translators around the world know that it's coming. So you need something like a publishing calendar, and here's an example from airtable.com of how you can show content behind the scenes, which is in the pipeline. You're then going to need some workflow to say, okay, what's the translation status of this? Maybe even have like approval from English into French and then sign off in French as well. And then the ability for someone to hit go live at the same time for all those versions to come out. If we think about that process for static reference information, so it might be about employee benefits or legal pages, for example, it's the same thing. But what you've got to watch out for is the lifespan of that content. So last year we did some work with a global telecoms company. All of their HR pages were available in about 26 different languages. And what would happen was someone in, say, Brazil would see a French page that they liked, and they would say, well, if I adjust that a little bit, I can translate it and use it in Portuguese on the Brazil site, which sounds great. But imagine if that French page was then updated with a change in conditions for employees. How does a person in Brazil know that they too have to update their translation? So you need some way of notifying the wave of changes that comes from a change in the master copy through to all the child copies that are in other languages. One of the things that also crops up quite a lot is about the cost of doing translation. So we worked with a mining company a couple of years ago, and they were just really clear that they're a global company. When we hire someone, we don't require that they speak the corporate language. If they're a local hire, we understand that they only speak their local language, and that's fine with us. So they had quite a big central budget to fund translation of anything that was important, and the central comms team would push it out. That's great. But often I work with comms teams who say, look, we don't have that budget. If we want to get a message out to our colleagues in Thailand, we're really relying on the Grace in Bangkok, who happens to be bilingual, being good enough as part of her job to take the message in English, translate it into Thai, and publish it. But we can't actually dictate what gets translated and what doesn't. So you get much less of a cohesive global model that way. But also you don't need to get approval for a great big translation budget. There's a middle ground that can sometimes work well, which is a summary-only model. So in the summary-only model, what you do is you create content in the company-wide language, and then someone takes maybe a 3-page document and writes a paragraph or two in the local language saying, this is what the big document's about. So that 1 or 2 paragraph summary allows someone who might not be a very confident English speaker to say, is this document relevant to me and going to be worth the effort of struggling through? And also, by having a couple of paragraphs at the start saying what it's about, you can help tune them into the topics that it covers, and maybe that probably helps with their comprehension of the more detailed document as well. Juha, is this something that you come across in terms of the workflow around managing translations?
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to add that a best practice that I've seen very often in our customers is that they tend to have some kind of a social workspace for the global content producer team. So you would have, in the Microsoft world, you would have a Yammer group for the content producers, or maybe a Teams channel. And if it's not Microsoft, then there are tools as Slack or such. Because, after all, in a big publicly listed company, an important news item is really prepared during weeks. So it's not just a matter of creating it and pushing it to the languages. There's a lot of discussion needed. The wording in the different language versions has to match exactly with the original message. So there's no way around a little bit of manual work there.
Yeah, good point. And I think it is good for people to understand not just what's coming, but maybe why it's coming and how the article is evolving as well. So some things to watch out for. First up, the language often reflects a culture as well. And in global organizations, there can be a sense of distance between things that are expressed maybe in the corporate language, which in a very literal translation don't come across very well from a cultural point of view. And I've worked a lot, for example, with Dutch colleagues. And if you take Dutch and do a very direct translation into English, it seems a bit blunt to us sensitive English types. We might feel that it's a bit too forceful and we would like it wrapping up in more fancy words. So you've got to be aware that you can't necessarily just do a machine translation, for example, without having a local then say, yeah, but we need to change the tone of this as well to get the message across. And there can be gotchas in semi-shared languages. So ones like between Spain and Argentina, where European Spanish has quite different verb conjugations to Argentinian Spanish, for example. So you couldn't take European Spanish and just publish it within Argentina. Same with Brazilian Portuguese versus European Portuguese. And even in English, I mean, I have to keep reminding myself when I'm reading a US English text that there are some words like quite. So when an American says this is quite good, they mean, yeah, just short of awesome. When a British person says quite good, they mean it's not awful or it's not bad. Mind you, given the English precedent for understatement, maybe not bad is another way of saying really quite awesome as well in English. Some languages just need a lot more physical space. So when you're designing the page, you've got to allow for that expansion. So this box diagram I've got on the right of the slide, if you take English as a reference point, then something like Danish and Japanese, and I think Finnish as well. Is that right? You heard that they're all quite compact languages, aren't they? They don't take a lot of space compared to the English one.
That's right. If you think about full sentences and paragraphs, right? But on the other hand, words in Finnish are very long, just like in some other languages. I think German is also notorious for that. So if you design like the navigation items, you know, or single buttons, then you have to really be careful about fitting the text there in all those different languages.
Right. Okay, great. And things like Spanish, Polish, and Hindi can take up to a third longer in terms of space. And then even the scripts. So if you go away from a Latin script to something like Arabic, Chinese, they can take a lot more vertical space as well. So think about that when you're designing buttons and menus. This example here, that's actually Thai. And if you go to the w3.org site, there's a very nice article. There's a link on that slide to that article just talking about script heights and things like right and left script alignment. When it comes to search, for this slide, I'm indebted to my colleague Martin White from Internet Focus, who not only knows an awful lot about search, but also knows an awful lot about multiple languages as well. And he sent me some interesting papers. And some of the things that struck me about search tools is that they can now automatically detect what the language of the source document is. But they usually build up an index which is language specific. So if you search for a phrase like global warming using the English keywords, it's actually going to only search the index of things that it's detected are in English. It's not going to find insights into global warming written in Chinese. It's actually incredibly rare for there to be a search engine that would do that. I hadn't really thought about this before, but yeah, if you work in a large organization then, and you search for a customer name that might be the same all around the world, say you're working with PwC or the BBC, you wouldn't think necessarily that your query was language specific, and you might be surprised that all your hits come back from your local market rather than saying the answer to what is my company doing with our clients around the world. And the answer is that they are working with PwC around the world, but the index is hiding things because the document's in a different language. Tagging too of multilingual content can be challenging. So something like SharePoint, it allows you to tag a document with multiple language translations of the tag. So you might have a document and tag it as global warming and then also say in Chinese, this is a Chinese word for it. I haven't got a clue what Chinese for global warming is, but I'm sure it exists. But then you need to think about how does a search engine interpret that? Because it could say, oh, we love metadata. We are going to make things that are well tagged very high up the search results. And you might end up promoting a document which is purely in Chinese as a result of an English search because it's got an English tag on it. And then when you think about multilingual social, you have some thoughts on this, I think.
Yeah, because, well, most of the intranets nowadays have some kind of a social component there, whether it's Facebook or Yammer or something. So what we've most seen, like one of the questions is, okay, so should we have some kind of a separate discussions per language? And what I've seen most customers do is they kind of let loose and they just have one, single comment feed, just like in this screenshot where you have maybe people commenting one news item and you see all those different comments in different languages there. Yammer actually has a decent in-place translation as well, but yeah, and I guess the people just prefer skipping the comments that they don't understand or they're not interested in.
I think the evolution of automated translation is an interesting one, isn't it? It used to be that companies would set up language-specific groups within something like Yammer. So you might have the German group on global warming and then the Chinese group on global warming. I think people now are pretty good at understanding when they request a machine translation, it's going to be approximate and be more tolerant of the fact that it's only a rough translation.
Yeah, definitely.
Which I guess brings us on to automated translation as an option. So Quite a few companies do use Google Translate and Bing Translate. And if you're on Office 365 and you ask SharePoint to automatically translate things, it will send it through to Bing Translate. Just as a security warning, though, it is actually then sending your content outside your firewall to a public server, and maybe your announcement about the Christmas dinner is fine, but there might be more corporate sensitive things that shouldn't be going out onto public cloud servers. In reality, though, a lot of translators, even professional translators, will use Google to get a rough cut, and then they'll do a final manual polish. And that final manual polish can be important because for things like legal documents, there's the concept of authorized translations. And again, I'm grateful to Martin White for telling me about this. Authorized translations mean that you have to have a certified translator who will take a legal document, produce it in another language, and almost like validate that this is the legal equivalent. And you can't just do that with machine translation at the moment.
Yeah, I think it's always a rough cut. I mean, it's always it's a good help, these like automated translations, but it's like 90%, 95% ready, depending on the target language a little bit as well.
Yeah. So I'm going to hand over to Juha now. Wedge, if you can give Juha screen control, and you're going to talk about making it work in SharePoint, and looking forward to seeing a live demo if we can.
Yeah, sure. Let's have a look at how to do it in SharePoint. Actually, I forgot to mention in the beginning that those of you who were expecting my colleague Knut to be here, unfortunately he's sick today, so he couldn't make it. So, but yeah. You made it until here, so thank you very much for your trust. So yeah, how to do it in SharePoint. So here's kind of a couple of the building blocks we have. Can you see my screen? Just making
all
sure.
Good. Yeah,
excellent, thank you. So yeah, in SharePoint there's a thing called variations, which is a feature that copies content from one language to others. There's something called MUI, Multilingual User Interface. Then you can do other things such as creating columns per language for the items, or setting up site collections per language. And I will show you examples of how these are done in real life. First of all, and the really kind of unfortunate thing about SharePoint is really that the variations is not something that I would recommend. So there's nothing worse than having to wait for several hours or sometimes days to get your master news item populated to the other languages. So once you've been through that a couple of times, you just start looking for some alternatives there. So we are not using variations, but I hope someday Microsoft can get that into a better shape. Okay, so what else is there? If you use multilingual user interface, first of all, that's not a complete solution for translations. It's not so much for the contents. It's more for the like user interface, like buttons and navigation elements and all of that. And it does a good job there. So MUI can translate the like native SharePoint UI features. That's why it's great actually for not so much for publishing intranets, but especially for teamwork scenarios where you're using SharePoint team sites and or maybe some more customized solutions within SharePoint. That's where this MUI really shines. And if you use it together with this column per language, as I call it, you get pretty close to Sam's option 2, which was the content variants. And I will show you an example of that soon. Then there's the option of creating a so-called site collection per language. So that was essentially your option 1, which is site per language. And then this is a kind of a robust setup that I really recommend, and that you can then enrich with, depending on how much budget you have and how much automation you have, you can do cross-site collection roll-ups. This would be Sam's option, mix and match basic. I think I got it right, where you fill up, where you fill up, just correct me if I'm wrong, but you fill up the local language sites with something from the global site if you don't have the translations. And then you can do more sophisticated things like content deep linking or automated content copying. So one approach is really to use MUI and columns per languages. What it means that, for those of you who know SharePoint, most of the contents are in some kind of lists or libraries where you have columns there. So MUI really takes care of translating the navigation, the web part titles, and the native buttons. And then depending on how many languages you have, you will have as many additional columns there. So in this screenshot, you can see how I'm creating a new item in a list, and we have a field for title. Then we have another field called title Spanish, then body Spanish. So in the poll in the beginning, we saw that many companies or organizations are using just 2 languages. So this might be a good approach for those who have maximum 2 languages. Then you do need a significant amount of custom development for the UI so that it knows which content item to display when. There are many examples of this. One is a municipality in Finland that is the screenshot that we're seeing here. So they have like 3,500 employees. 50% of them speak Finnish and 50% speak Swedish. So this is what we did. We duplicated the columns, and so in this screenshot, the user is a Finn, or Finnish-speaking person, so they are seeing it in Finnish. But if you're a Swedish-speaking person, meaning you have that information in your user profile or browser preferences, then you will see it all in Swedish. The real downside here is that you will obviously have a hard time scaling it up for 3 or more languages, because you will have to create additional columns. There was a significant overhead in development, making it all work. And also the search indexing and search scoping is a little bit more tricky, because the contents are like in one single item, so it's more difficult to scope that. But yeah, for 2 languages, this might be a good approach. Then this mix and match basic, as I call it. So this is everybody I talk to, most of the big companies out there using SharePoint and figuring out how to do multilingual, they end up with something like this. So it's about separating your contents into site collections. And a little bit, as opposed to Sam's, or to refine Sam's example, it's not always about site collection per language. It might be site collection per country. Because many times, just think about Germany and Austria, for instance. Typically, both they speak German, but they do want their own contents because they have different legislation, right? So they want to talk about the human resources policies or whatever in their local country, and not just in their local language. So the landing page might be like this, where the user chooses their language, and then this is the global site where the global content producers produce their content, but this is not so much where the users spend their time. So you can see the area marked in red, that's like indicating the site the user is in. And here I am a German user on the German site, so I'm mostly seeing contents from the German site, but thanks to those so-called search-based roll-ups, I'm also seeing content from the global site. And here's the navigation. So really, in this model, each country or language can manage their navigation structure independently. And this, as every approach, this has some pros and cons. And a good advantage of this is that you might have a really small country or small office in a company, so you don't want to duplicate the whole content structure from the global into the local ones. You can have a really more restricted one. Sometimes you just don't have, the muscle to create all this new fresh content there. So you can also make these like mixed roll-ups. As you can see here, this is the so-called Our People roll-up on the front page on the German side. So it displays whatever is newest. So there's a new employee presentation. The first one is in German, so it's from the German side, but the second most recent is actually a English speaking person. So there's always fresh content, whether they've been able to produce it locally or not. Okay, then I will show you another demo, which is a little bit more sophisticated, because here it's about automated content copying and translating. And this I will show you with a real life demo. So the overview is like this. We are talking about alert news. So on the global side, the global content producer creates in an alert news and wants to push it to the countries or languages. So we have this really nice tool called Microsoft Flow, which is in Office 365, and Microsoft Translator. So we created a flow that what it does, it sends email alerts to the local content producers. It might, by the way, as well, create a post in this social workspace for the content producers. If you have a channel in Microsoft Teams, for instance, Microsoft Flow could post there a message saying there's a new alert news now, please translate. And what it also does here in this example, it actually creates a copy of this global item and automatically translates it and saves it as a draft so that the local content producer can go and finalize and publish it. Okay, so here I am let's have a quick tour first on the site. So this is the global site like this. This is where we produce the global contents, and this is the German side. Okay, so they are really separate site collections, just using some search-based roll-ups displaying contents from elsewhere. And this indicator, and by using this here, I can also jump if I want to see what's on the China side. I could go have a look there. So
could you get back again if you did that?
Sorry?
Just say if you change it into Chinese, could you get back again? That's always the challenge, isn't it, when you change language settings?
Yeah, that's really good point, because on the China side, and we do have customers using this tool in Chinese, so it's real stuff really. So this is all in Chinese now, and I do have a little bit of trouble now figuring out which one of these actually is the German side that I came from. But luckily there's a back
in trouble for you. Yeah,
in the browser. Yeah, thanks for the question. So yeah, now I'm the global content producer, and I want to publish a so-called alert news, something for the whole company. So I just have the content here ready. So it has a title like this, and it has a body. So I will publish this in English now. Okay, so what it does, as soon as I've published it or saved it, and there's an expiration date also for the alert news in our model. So now it's sent out an email to this German content producer saying, and here I have the mailbox of the German content producer, and here I have the email alert, which is saying, hi, the global content manager has published an alert news. It's copied into your language as a draft. Please go ahead and finalize. And it even copies here the translated content. And all I have to do as a German content producer is I follow this link, because this link takes me directly to my automatically translated German version. And here it is. This is the machine translated content. So those of you who speak German, you can evaluate if this is good for publishing or not. There's always something that you need to maybe finalize here, but yeah, this is the way you go. And this is still a draft, so the end users don't see the item yet, obviously. So the final step, as it says here, pending. So the final step is, as the content producer or approver in Germany, I just go and approve this item. So actually I have another window open here as a reader, so we can just review what it looks like. So the alert news is something that is prominent here on the front page. So like this is the alert news that we created in global, automatically translated to Germany and push it there, and the German person finalized and published it.
Very nice.
So yeah, but obviously then if you want to go deeper into this, you start noticing that it's a real can of worms, really, this automated translation, because there's also the case of deleting the source item. There's modifying the source item. So obviously if you modify it and publish, you cannot just automatically create a new version and you know, override the existing one that has been carefully translated in the target sites. So yeah, the deeper you dig into this, you will notice that the more you will spend time and money working on it, and let alone these scenarios of really deep linking content items. So yeah, unfortunately that is something that we've done as well, but it does require a little bit of more work, that's sure.
Okay, great. Is that everything you wanted to go through, Juha?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. So I had a quick question about the email-based workflow you had then. Does the German editor see the source text somewhere? Because we need to know it's a good translation, you want to say, well, what did it start out as?
Yeah, so that's a matter of really formatting the email message, and this flow example that I did with the automatic translations, to be honest, it took me less than 10 minutes. So it's a matter of really placing all those fields there. You can very easily add the source and the target versions into the email, and that's a very good idea and very, very easy to implement.
Yeah, fantastic. Right, so we're open for Q&A. I think we've had some questions coming already, Wedge, if you want to pick one for us to start off with.
Yes, thinking back to the translation models you discussed, Sam, Taha asks, in variant systems, how do you manage the translation from the target to the source?
Yeah, so if we're talking about Microsoft variations and how it works in SharePoint, for example, you basically have the reference site, let's call that the parent site, where you will create things in the original language. So if we say the parent site is going to be in English, you then create subsites for each of the countries or languages that you want to represent. So you might have a subsite for French, for example. And what happens in the setup is that if I create something new in the parent site in English, that will trigger workflow for the owner of the French site saying, there's a new item here, you need to translate it. So it will be pushed down into the French site, but it won't be published. It will stay in draft until they've gone in, created the French translation of it, and also hit publish on the French site. And then the good thing about variations, they have their shortfalls, but the good thing about SharePoint variations is that if I then change the text in the parent copy, that will trigger another workflow saying there is an edit made, Mr. French editor, please go in and check it and republish if you want to. So that's a basic managed relationship, and that's what Juha was saying, that if you reproduce this with workflow, then you also have to think about how knotty and tricky does it get to reproduce all those dependencies. I mean, yeah, I don't want to over-egg this, because pragmatically speaking, I do also see, for example, global HR teams where they all sit together and they say, right, you know, we're going to make this policy change. We support 10 different languages. And someone basically says, right, everybody, we're all in the same office. We need to get translations done. So not everything has to be really fancy workflow. If you all sit as a team, or if you have even that Yammer group saying there's maybe only 10 things a year that we need to translate, so we can coordinate it manually. It's just you've got to be careful when you get to thousands of documents and a lot of languages to support.
Okay, this one's for you.
You wanted to add to that?
Oh, sorry, go on. Juha, can I ask a question on behalf of Arnold?
Yeah, go ahead.
Arnold asks, isn't having several languages in the same publishing page devaluating the relevance for the search engine?
Yeah, it is, and that's what I think he's referring now to this bilingual municipality where we created like multiple columns for one content item. So that's exactly one of the shortcomings. So the search is a lot more difficult to get right. Yeah.
Okay, and Arnold also asks, when you're creating all of these translations, how do you link to the correct version of the page for the correct person?
Okay, so the email alert that I sent in that example, that was just a hard-coded email address, but in reality there is typically an AD group called like Content Producers Germany, something like that. So that's I think that's the standard way to do it. I hope I understood the question correctly.
Well, maybe we can also answer the variation or the other way of interpreting that, which is how does SharePoint know that Josephine is French and would like to see French? Because I kind of sweepingly said, oh yeah, it picks up the user preference and shows Josephine the French page. But what's going on there? Is that normally taken from the browser language setting or the AD setting?
Okay, so the end user's point of view. So in our model and the demo I showed you, actually the user, first thing they see is a landing page where they choose their preferred language, or actually it's the country. So that's where they will spend most of their time. Now, when it comes to SharePoint's native features such as this MUI, multilingual user interface, there's like a hierarchy, and it does interpret. It does read the user profile and the preferred language that's there. It also reads the browser's preferred language, and if I'm not mistaken, also the landing page. And so the multilingual user interface detects the language from many different sources, actually.
And again, the logic of that can get quite tricky, can't it? So again, thinking at the telecoms company we were working with, there were a lot of people in Germany who were expats that said, well, I want to see the German pay and employment conditions, but I want to see them in English because I'm an expat. So you can't just assume that language and country are synonymous for what people want to see.
Yep, that's right. There are some really tricky combinations there. That's right.
Any more questions?
Yes, Michelle asks, can you manage the translations and the flow of translations via a mobile device? And possibly more importantly, how do these translations work within the SharePoint app?
Okay, so if I'm a content producer, actually maybe this work isn't something that I would do in mobile. Obviously, if it's about the scenario of alert news, it might really be something that I want to publish right away. So you get the email alert and you get the link to the list. So the German content producer in our example will certainly have, this one. So I will obviously be able to open this email on my mobile phone, and also this SharePoint list where I'm working on the translation. That is then either opened in your mobile browser or in the SharePoint app, and in both scenarios it is I think it's usable. It's okay to, as long as it's a simple list as this one, you could definitely do it all on mobile. Yeah, the flow itself, I think it also has a mobile app. I have to check that.
It does, yeah.
Yeah, although this is maybe not a scenario that, like, it's almost programming. creating a flow, and there's a lot of conditions. It looks simple here, but the UI is complex, so I wouldn't go and create a flow with just my mobile phone, unless I just want to modify it a little bit or finalize it with the phone. But otherwise, it's a desktop use case.
Maybe we should just go to one last question, Wedge, and then we'll wrap up.
Certainly. So thinking about mixed language intranet homepages, are they acceptable? Do the end users appreciate a mixed language homepage?
I think everybody would like the entire page to be in the preferred language, ideally, but also most people who work for global companies, they do accept that they will have to work in a second language quite a lot of the time. And I think part of actually some of the appeal of working for a multinational is that you get exposed to other cultures and other languages as well. So the important thing to test for me is always, do our employees understand the communication that we're trying to give them? And if their competence is good enough or the message is simple enough, then not everything has to be translated.
And we can't answer something that applies to all of the end users out there. I mean, it depends on not only the country, but also the company culture. So we know that Russians, for instance, they need to have everything in Russian, whereas Finns and Danes are okay with reading most of the stuff in English, although we are more social and more active when we have it in our own language, and so on. So it really depends on where you are, which country and which culture.
Excellent. So thank you, everybody. We have a parting gift for you from ClearBox, which is every year we do an annual review of SharePoint Intranet in a Box products. So you've seen an example just now from Valo. There are 33 similar products or other choices that we also reviewed and rated. And you might have seen Valo were one of the ones that we recognize for offering very good value in this space. But there's no single best product for everyone. And if you're thinking of adding to your SharePoint functionality to make it a well-rounded intranet, and you're interested in multiple languages, that is something that we picked out in our evaluations of which products we did things well. So if you want to get 10% off, I can see we should have put a code in there. We didn't. We put unique code in there. So look out for an email coming out from us later on today or early tomorrow. Well, we'll send you a link for the recording of the webinar and also that code. It will be SPR18 Valo Webinar.